A very interesting problem often comes across the organizer when you're on the street, or whether you're organizing political officials or anyone, is that when you're going through some of these exciting policies for the development of the Canadian North, the development of Africa, or a 50, 60, three-generational outlook for society as a response to the impending global economic meltdown, which generally, most people know in some confused way is looming on the horizon. They just don't really fully know how to think about it because there's so much other bullshit being fed to them in the media. But when you're organizing people, like this just happened to me the other day, where this student, he was a political science student, was completely on the ball with what's going down. And as soon as I introduced questions like the development of nuclear energy, the necessity to increase our access to energy, to development projects like we used to do in the 1950s and 60s and 70s as a very normal thing. As soon as I started describing these things to end poverty and hunger, and I realized that I'd lost him. And his response back to me was, well, don't you think we've done enough to the planet? Shouldn't we be undoing some of these development projects that we did over the years? Like, hadn't we scarred Mother Nature enough? And it didn't surprise me, because this is something you come across from time to time, more, increasingly in recent years. And I think it gets at an interesting paradox, because here we don't want corruption. People would rather, if you asked them if they would rather give up their sovereignty to an international body of unelected officials to police the world, their general answer would be, hell no. It's not something you run towards. Or your ability to produce food. Would we want to reduce our freedom to produce food and in fact reduce our sphere of activity on the world to do these things? And again, your answer is generally, you'd rather not have a genocide in the world. You'd rather people not starve. But then there's a certain conception which these types of responses, that here we are, there's a certain pristine, perfect nature untouched by humans, and then there's humans, which are somehow something outside of nature. The whole progress of the development of the universe was one thing, and then there's us, and we go against that thing. And this idea that we're a foreign species, sort of like a virus infecting a body, a host body, Mother Gaia, who is slowly choking by our simple existence. And so we have to come head on and deal with this, because if you think on the surface, there are certain reasons, if you're thinking very superficially about what it means to be a human being, to believe that. Here we are over the course of the entire development of the human species up until now, or of the human species, of life in general, and we seem to be the least fit to survive. There's the fact that we're very hairless, we don't have big claws, we're little fangs, not very useful if you're up against a pack of hyenas, or even like your average big gorilla would tear any of us to shreds. So you think, like, here we are, supposedly one of the newest members of living species into this planet, and for some reason we physically seem like we're the least fit to our environment, the least fit to be able to survive in the diverse climates. So that's one thing that seems very unnatural. Every other species, you can literally look at any map and you'll find that they're not all over the planet. There's generally going to be, what's going to bind them will be a genetic or an environmental factor, which will be reduced to climate. So you'll have polar bears in the north. You're not going to find them in South America. You've got flamingos in their climate. And all species tend to be isolated. Whereas the boundary conditions for the human species don't really seem to be so fixed. Right? Here we are, every possible habitable, and even you'd consider uninhabitable portion of the world, if you've ever seen pictures of the northern tundra, seem to have human species who have figured out ways to survive across this earth. And it's long been regarded by great thinkers throughout history that this is the case, that there's something very special and unique about us. And I'd say one of those things that's been captured from Egypt to the Greeks onward is the fact that we produce things like poetry. Great art is something which uniquely comes out of the human species. There's something about that. And I think no good class on Darwin should ever begin without beginning with a really good poem. And keep that in mind, in case if any of you ever find yourselves giving a class on the fraud of Darwin, remember that. Start with a great poem. Okay, mental note. So let's. Oh, by the way, the title for the class is right there. I'm very proud of that title. All right. This is a poem written in the late 1800s. Without going into details of who wrote this or in the context politically of when it was written, but I thought JP, who was kind enough to read this thing a few times through to prepare himself, will read this aloud and we can discuss it. Same thing.
Unexpressed. Deep in my heart that aches with the repression and strive with plenitude of bitter pain, there lives a thought that clamors for expression and spends its undelivered force in vain. What boots it that some other may have thought it? The right of thought's expression is divine. The price of pain I pay for it has bought it. I care not who lays claim to it, 'tis mine. And yet, not mine until it be delivered. The manner of its birth shall prove the test. Alas, alas, my rock of pride is shivered. I beat my brow, the thought still unexpressed.
We could read that again after, but does anybody have a hypothesis of what the subject of this poem is? Yeah?
He's saying like a thought that never develops, like kind of like a thought that occurred to him, but he couldn't get it out.
Well, there seems to be there's something divine. The right of thought's expression is divine. It seems to be a very specific thought that he's having, but it hasn't quite manifest. If he says here at the beginning, at the end, the thought is still unexpressed. So it seems like it's not just any old thought, but there's a certain type of thought. Yeah?
Well, I don't know if this is an answer to your question, but it sounds like there's some sort of censorship involved here. He has thoughts that he wants to express, and there's something preventing him from doing it.
There is something. There's something about a repression, right? You got the word repression in there.
Yeah.
But it might not be such a physical repression either, maybe, in terms of, I don't think there's a tyrannical censorship that's happening necessarily. But you're right. There's some sort of an obstacle to its expression that's happening. Yeah.
It seems to me to be an expression of a tragedy, and a tragic expression to it.
Mm-hmm.
There's a certain tension of his not being able to express this that makes the issue of it.
Yeah, you want to be able to express this thing. And the idea that a thought, again, it's there's a price of pain that entitles him to it. He's claimed it. This thought, it's already his. But yet, he hasn't quite seen it. Now, do you know who Paul Laurence Dunbar is? Oh, yeah, you got an idea?
I was just going to say that it seems to me the idea that you can know something in your mind without being able to put it into words, and that's the power of your mind, and that it's an idea that your mind internally is able to figure out, absent of your five senses, which is the whole idea of Platonism versus Aristotelianism, and that the mind is able to conceive of higher creative processes and hypothesize, and that sometimes our mind is so powerful that we know something, but yet our language is insufficient enough for us to find a way to express it, and that's the difference between humans and all other animals on Earth.
Oh, and that's the secret of the universe. No, yeah, I mean, there's something there, right? That the idea, you could try to, if you have an idea that's not literal, that's not like this table, you can't express it in some, like if he was just thinking about, oh, I wish this cake was made, he could describe the cake, or, you know, that it could be expressed in a very literal way that everyone could understand, because a cake has a certain, you know, you can get a definition that everyone can agree upon. It's a physical thing. Whereas an idea is not something you can sort of lock down in a way that everyone will necessarily agree on the definition. You know.
I was gonna
It'll
say-
lose something in translation. Like,
You might.
how is that?
Yeah.
Just think about the concept of that. That to lose something in translation
Yeah.
means that the idea itself is different from the words used to express that idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It touches on this idea of metaphor too. But you were going to say something?
No, sorry. No.
Okay. Because yeah, the question I was going to ask, the next one obviously was the author. Does anybody know who Paul Laurence Dunbar was? No? I wish I had a picture. He was the first generation of newly freed slaves after Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, who understood, because he found his inspiration in Frederick Douglass, one of Lincoln's major collaborators, who made it his life's mission. He was a freed slave, or he is an escaped slave, who taught himself science, literature, and realized he made it his life's mission to free the shackles, the mental shackles, the cultural shackles of slavery. And that's what he owes. Frederick Douglass understood that as being the real enemy of mankind is not the physical shackles, because when you free the slave, there's still a slave culture that they've come out of, with slave definitions of ideas.
You're speaking of Douglas now? Or?
Douglas, who is the mentor of Paul Laurence Dunbar, and the inspiration. And Dunbar as well made that his mission as well, and produced one of the most fruitful expressions of the first African-American poetry in this century. I'd say even in history. And he understood as well that even though the slaves had recently been freed, just a couple of years before his birth, that racism, the ideas of the inferiority of species, was still very present and becoming more present in his lifetime, and made it his point to free people by expressing their creativity and encourage the development of the arts. He was best friends with the Wright brothers and other things. I think he's getting at freedom. That's my hypothesis right now. I can't say it's necessarily right.
It's a universal idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's it. Well, one thing which I thought was interesting about the nature of ideas,
Mm-hmm.
they're the kind of things that you can own wholly,
Mm-hmm.
and yet other people can lay claim to them too.
You mean like they can plagiarize them, or they could?
They can have it as wholly as you have it in your mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right.
When he says to his mind,
Yeah.
he knows that it belongs to him.
Mm-hmm. Even though others, what boots it? I guess boots is who cares that others have had it, or may have thought it. Yeah. Right. That's good. That's a good observation. Yeah. And so, could we sense something of the author's essence expressed in his creation as well? Can we get a certain idea, do we think, in our minds of the character of the man who would have written something of that sort, even if we didn't necessarily know his history? Yeah?
I don't think he would have liked Sartre. Or
Probably. Yeah, you could actually probably say that. Yeah. If anybody. Yeah, he probably would have not liked the existentialists that much. He wouldn't have been drawn or gravitated towards existentialist writings. That's probably true. Yeah.
Why doesn't sound like what you were saying about before with cultural pessimism? It doesn't look like much of a pessimist. He looks more altruistic.
Mm-hmm.
very optimistic.
Strange, because that's the opposite. Well, it's not the opposite, but it's an interesting counterpoint to Meredith's observation of there's something tragic about it, but yet optimistic. It's kind of paradoxical.
To me, I always think of this idea of tragedy, of trying to shock the audience into a realization that allows them to give aid to tragedy in actual life. And to me, the expression of this fight, this struggle that he's having, trying to squeeze this thought out in some sort of expressible form, and failing. At the end of the poem, I beat my brow, the thought still unexpressed. I guess it's not a completed tragedy. I mean, he's still alive. He's still beating his brow. That sort of thing.
Yeah.
But for me, it instills this desire to express something, this desire to communicate. It sort of speaks to the part of me that hasn't expressed some of the more profound thoughts that I've had.
Yeah, if anything, he compels you. He's compelling your mind to want to make a hypothesis, which is sort of an act, but that's not a material act. Really.
Seems to be quite a passion.
Do you want to read it one more time, maybe before, or do you guys want to try it one more time?
What did you mean by hypothesis? So he's trying to
Oh,
imply
there's an ambiguity in there, right? Like, what is it exactly that the subject is that's unexpressed? Right?
Hypothesis about the subject.
About the subject, and also, what is it in the mind of the author? What is it in his intention that he's trying to convey?
Well, it's not necessarily unique to a poem like this, right? You'd say literature in general. Or
Sure.
in general.
Yeah, you'd always look. Yeah, that's a question you could always ask. It didn't come out of the blue. It was written by a human being.
All right, of course.
Anyway, the question is now, what was the nature of the human being's essence? Well, what was something about their personality that comes through, or that's expressed in their creation? Because ants don't make art in order to communicate anything, really. They do what they do. They're ants. They do it well. But they don't try and inspire each other to do it better, necessarily. Yeah?
I like what he says, like, the right of thought's expression is divine. So it's like God-given that you're able to express yourself or come up with ideas. It's like a God-given ability.
Yeah.
You also have the freedom to express those thoughts. If you have it, we live in a culture which is we're corrupting ourselves into not expressing our good.
Right.
So that's when you understand that the real evil is believing ghosts, believing that ghosts exist, and that there's certain things you're not allowed to do when you're divinely inspired.
Like self-censorship, just people tend to police their own minds in a certain sense. Yeah, that brings up another question, is like, really, could somebody with a slave identity have written something like that? Could somebody, who sees himself in that way? So this idea of freedom is another one of these things. We've got this. If you were a pure materialist thinker and you were so fixated with trying to define things in their mechanical characteristics, in their material characteristics, looking at human beings, right, on the physical level, on the one hand, seems kind of unnatural that we exist. Seeing that, again, you think about this quality of freedom, this idea of freedom, tends to have historically been responsible and the instigator for the greatest revolutions in culture, in politics, in philosophy, in science. And so it seems to be there seems to be something about it that gives man an impetus to act in a way that doesn't necessarily ensure his individual security. Right? Because generally speaking, whenever these big changes in society happen, it's at the expense of a certain fixed structure. You've got a revolution of a new idea that's introduced, something, a new conception of governance that's introduced, and that disturbs everything, from the education to the hierarchies to everything, is going to be changed. Now, for good or for bad, though, see, because this is the other consequence. When this happens, sometimes the results tend to produce a Jacobin mob who are confused but desire some end to tyranny, and then you get a Napoleon who offers them some security. Sometimes you get an Obama after some 8 years of tyrannical George Bush philosophies, And again, there's something that he's appealing to in people's desires that they can't quite express, but it's there, and it's like an attractive force. So it exists. It's an efficient thing that we'll find in every human being. That we get sad when somebody takes it away from us. There's a certain depression in the air that occurs, an anxiety that arises. And yet, if you ask everybody or anyone that you ask, what is it, they'll tend to give you a different definition. Right? And it's true. You could think of, what are some ideas? What are some definitions of freedom that people either have come across or have thought of on their own? Like if we were going to lock it in the box, let's say, if we were going to just try and define it. Yeah.
Avoidance of work.
Avoidance of work. Avoidance of work is freedom.
The favorite among 7th graders.
Meredith teaches part-time in a school. Any other idea? Yeah?
Like free to choose, free to buy what you want.
Free to do what you want, pick what you want. Yeah. Okay. Free to do what you want to do. All right.
The ability to pursue your own desires
Yeah.
without obstruction from some other human being or some other any obstacle.
Any obstacle. Kind of plays off of. It's kind of related to Petros's a little bit. To Petros's example a little bit. Yeah.
The right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness.
You're an idealist.
Where did you get that idea?
Yeah.
Goes from John Locke.
Yeah.
Responsibility?
Freedom to have responsibility?
Freedom is responsibility.
Freedom is responsibility. Responsibility to what? Well, maybe we don't have to get there yet. Maybe that's a definition. We'll put that on pause for a bit, but that's okay.
The opposite of the 7th grade.
The counterpoint to that, yeah. Okay.
It's true because you're responsible not to offend anybody else's rights, at least. Right?
Well,
Sure.
think of the freedom that comes with using fire as a simple example.
Mm-hmm.
But then, you quickly come up against the responsibility when you accidentally light a forest on fire.
Right.
And then you realize, you don't have to understand how to use it.
Right. Okay.
Or the freedom that comes with nuclear power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm going to get at that. You also got ideas like the absence of war. Some people will define it as an absent force, or that's like peace, or the absence of laws, I guess. If you don't have to obey things, thus the absence of laws equals freedom. So either way you look at it, there's a whole variety and manifold amount. We know, though, like I said, when people do it, their individual security tends to be reduced. So it seems as if we take as an observation or as an assumption that life desires security and not death, if that's generally a quality of living things, that they don't pursue their own quicker mortality, then it seems paradoxical that human beings do things that put themselves in states where their health and life is jeopardized because of this intangible thing that doesn't seem to quite really materially exist. Right. The slaves' uprise, this collaborator of Abraham Lincoln, Henry C. Carey, pointed out that of all of the 2 million slaves brought into America, into the South, 2/3 had disappeared without any trace of having existed because they wanted something better, and they organized uprisings. They didn't have the insight that Paul Laurence Dunbar had necessarily, but they also didn't have literacy. They weren't given the freedom to have knowledge. And if the master did generally learn that your slaves could read, the slave would quickly be shot, because that would mean that he could teach it. And no master really wants a thinking slave. It's an old law of the master-slave paradox. The idea of a tyrant, if a tyrant, let's say, had his expression of freedom, there'd be two different types. You generally notice that the tyrant would have one for the people who he wishes to have in his herd. Right? What can you imagine a tyrant's idea of freedom would technically usually be something to the lines of...
The tyrant's concept of freedom for you?
For you. Yeah, would generally be something to the effect of, the freedom to protect nation and, or, state and leader, That's your freedom. Just to maintain the status quo. Take some pride in that, Or, but that wouldn't be the same definition he would apply to himself. Right. The definition would probably be something more in the lines of what you and Petros had hypothesized. The idea of the tyrant's idea of freedom for himself is probably just to do whatever he wants to do, or to maintain the power such that he can continuously express his will without any boundaries by, laws of any sort or responsibility that's outside of what he wants. Okay, so that's on the one hand. All right, yet another reason why humans seem to be unnatural. Now, another thing that's been observed for a long time is that going hand in hand with freedom, which tends to be something of a more emotional expression, is the fact that because we are investigating and thinking through people's different perceptions and ideas of what freedom means, there's the fact that human beings have been long known to be endowed with a very powerful intellect.
But
Yes.
Is freedom the same as liberty?
We're going to get there. But this quality of our intellect has also created a condition where here we have animals, livestock, that you could say enslave in a certain sense for our meat consumption. We grow fruit in agriculture in ways that would never happen by themselves in nature. Whole species of animals have been developed. Like, you can't see a farm. Can you really see a farm animal, your average cow, surviving very long in the wild? So these, over the years, we've actually found and channeled evolution towards a place where it's benefited and alleviated our suffering, our need for food, our wants, our burdens, to the point that these animals live probably, more bountifully on the earth than nature would ever allow them. There'd never be this many cow and chicken species or individuals on a planet at any other point in time without human beings. Or the fact that oranges are sweet. You ever see an orange in the wild is something which is bitter and sour. It's not very tasty. So is a grape. But then you see, well, what is the effect of human beings? And we've actually taken these things which sort of naturally occur and made them better. That's subjective. You could argue that that's subjective, huh?
Better for us.
Yeah, exactly. You could say so, but you could also say perhaps that it's even better for a lot of the environment. It's actually been an improvement upon the biosphere, that we've taken regions that had no life, like all of California, which is a desert by nature, and we've produced the world's biggest vegetable growing region out of this completely lifeless desert.
We've also done the other way around.
And that's the catch, right? So you'll notice that with intelligence has become the increased ability to destroy things too. Our wars, when you look at an Iron Age to a Copper Age, kill a much greater body count in the Iron Age. Or a Nuclear Age society, will produce weapons that will wipe out way more people than a 17th century, army. So we also have this thing where when we increase our production to alleviate our fear of starvation or of freezing, we have a greater chance of falling prey to gluttony or decadence. So you could say increasing production coincides often with an increase in people who just let it all out, and just get gluttonous. So this is, I think, where your idea of responsibility also kind of plays a role.
It sounds like Spider-Man.
Yeah, I was trying to. I know. I was trying to avoid that too. We'll just put that on the sidelines for now.
Because you got the powers, you have to do the right thing.
Yeah. So anyhow, these are all things which create an increased destability, disequilibrium, you could say, with nature. And the question becomes, well, then where does this freedom arise? Right? Is it from the fact that we have a lucky genetic mutation that gave our species the lucky edge over other species, that we were thus better able to kill all the other species and survive more efficiently? Thus we developed an intellect? right? That's a random mutation principle that you could go with. You could also go with the fact that we have an intellect because we developed a big prefrontal cortex, right? Animals don't have, or monkeys don't have as big of and dense of a prefrontal cortex as we have. You could say that's the cause for intelligence, right? Yeah?
Yeah, I read a book that said it's also had to do with fish, because fish is like brain food, so they ate more fish and they got smarter.
So
that doesn't explain why other animals that eat fish don't get smart.
Right, yeah. That's why bears aren't reading Plato. You're like... Yeah, that's why statistical analysis doesn't tend to work. Right, so we could also say that maybe we developed the prefrontal cortex in order to express intelligence. That's one way of looking at it too.
Like we reverse the cause?
Yeah, invert it. Invert the question, right? But that would, of course, mean that there's an existence of intelligence without human beings. It's pretty epistemologically profound in implications. But that's one thing. So you got, luckily, a venue. Normally when you'd address these questions, you have a certain place to go as a human being to answer them. And that's sort of, you could say, there's something, again, that we only do along with poetry, which is science, right? And if we want to answer these questions and tackle them really head on, you go to one of the subspecies of science. You know, you got these, if that's your genus, you've got the different species and subsets, which, you know, you got physics, you got psychology, you know, chemistry. You can sort of see this branching out, right? But since we're talking about living things, we're talking about humans, we're talking about life, we probably go to biology. Right. Now, in asking the question, like any scientist would do, you would look for the contradictions. What isn't contradictory between somebody's perception of something and what you're actually seeing? In our case, what we're looking at is, you know, human societies in physical reality throughout space-time. If you're just trying to explain away how things happen, you tend not to make discoveries. What a real scientist always does historically is they look for those things that are contradictory, right? And try to resolve what caused that contradiction. Now, in biology, you can ask certain questions, and you'll find that increasingly, especially over the recent years, you're going to get attacked as all hell. There's certain questions that have been banned, actually, from any type of debate or academia or anything. Now, you'll notice this with especially Charles Darwin's scientific explanation of the development of species. You'll get that in asking certain questions which are outside of the boundaries of what his theory explains, you will get not just scientists who, using the scientific method of actually taking it into consideration and investigating it to see if it's true, you'll generally just get slandered and attacked for being a fundamentalist creationist. And that'll be the end of the debate, dead, right there. You must be ignorant if you don't believe. If you don't believe in Charles Darwin, there must be something wrong with you, right? You got to believe.
Well, it ain't just Charles Darwin.
Yeah, there's Richard Dawkins. I mean, look, the most that.
I'm saying you're not just believing in what Charles Darwin said. You're believing in a lot of other minds that are built upon.
And that's the thing, right? When you start building a structure, what is the foundation that you're building it upon? Because you're assuming that the foundation is sound when you start building a structure.
Sure, it's significant.
Yeah. So, if there's assumptions in there that are not sound, like for example, just simply raising the question, how is it that living things can come from a world that contain no living things? By what process within Darwin's theory begins to explain that process?
Well, as he stated, it didn't. Since then, there are explanations and theories.
Yeah, there are explanations and theories, but they don't actually address the paradox, because they explain away it by saying, you know, either it's crystals that formed on a primordial ooze. There are certain, you know, light beams. They tried creating experiments in the 60s and 50s and 70s even in gas chambers to produce some sort of a, something of life, which didn't work. But the theories were there. But then the difference is, what's the difference between a theory that's based upon, what's just the difference between a theory that doesn't apply to reality and a theory which resolves a process in reality? Like let's say Kepler's opinion of elliptical orbits. Right? You could say was just another opinion of an infinite variety of opinions that would explain away how the planets move in the solar system. But if you took a survey, a consensus, you'll find that pretty much all of the opinions except for Kepler's were wrong. And that's because he was asking a different type of question, a more causal question, which no one else was, who was trying to just sort of explain what paths would account for the motions of the planets. He was actually trying to find, well, what's the physical cause since this is happening? Not my mathematical paper here, but it's happening in physical reality. Saying, well, maybe this, why did nobody ever ask what effect the sun has? It's a pretty big thing, and nobody bothered asking that question. And he spent 12 years of his life probing into that question and looking at the contradictions. So you could say that opinion has more weight, literally physically has more weight, because it applies to the physical reality, where the other ones don't really have weight. They're just sort of floating in the realm of pure ideas, or assumptions, you could say.
Well, we can make that distinction now because of what we built down.
Sure. You could say, but that's right, because we tested it out. We applied it to reality, and it was able to forecast when things were going to happen. It would help us get to the moon, other things, whereas the others did not. Right. Now you could say one of the problems here, one of the key individuals who you'll find in society today, who's a major advocate for Darwin, is Richard Dawkins. You guys know who this guy is? Yeah, Richard Dawkins. Selfish Gene. Have the book over there. It's God delusion. You name it. Now, this is the type of thing that I think exposes sort of the very fearful nature of what Dawkins represents. This is a little section of the preface to his The Selfish Gene book, written about 30 years ago and updated about 12 times. There's about 12 different editions out there. Here we go. Okay. Can I get a volunteer to just read this little bit? Anybody? Yeah? Yeah, go for it.
Okay. Living organisms had existed on Earth without ever knowing why for over 3,000 million years before the truth finally dawned on one of them. His name was Charles Darwin. His name was Charles Darwin.
Yeah, that's better. That's good.
To be fair, others had inklings of the truth, but it was Darwin who first put together a coherent and tenable account of why we exist. We no longer have to resort to superstition when faced with the deep problems. Is there a meaning to life? What are we for? What is man? After posing the last of these three questions, the eminent zoologist G.G. Simpson put it thus. The point I want to make now is that all attempts to answer that question before 1859 are worthless, and that we will be better off if we ignore them completely.
Yeah.
Sounds like a tolerant.
So we got a certain small little chunk of human history that we get to ignore now from considering this question. Yeah, go for it. Asad? No, you did.
Thinking maybe Dawkins and the selfish gene of Charles Darwin.
He inherited.
Well. So now, what do we think that Richard Dawkins or what's his name, G.G. Simpson would think of something?
Just call him Gigi.
G.G. Yeah. What do you think of something like this?
Maybe?
Yeah.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among them For among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. U.S. Declaration of Independence, 1776.
Oh, 1776.
Before the
Right. Damn it. Alas. So, there's a certain high priesthood that's formed in our society, sadly. And it's tough to admit because you think here we are, the apex of human civilization with, really cool 3D graphics and Avatar and, look at Facebook. I mean, how could you possibly go higher than that? But there's a certain structure which is not really too physical, but it's manifested itself. And Darwin is another high priest. You had a similar thing with the Inquisition, where anybody who would go against, even if a Protestant would say something that was contradictory to the rituals found in the Catholic faith, they were a witch. They were going to be burned. Because the truth was there. There was a absolute unique truth. In this case, it's Darwin who had it of all of the development of human society and species. But you would lose your job. You wouldn't make it very far in whatever institutions were around at that time. Yeah.
I was just going to say that to hear you tell it, it sounds like the Darwinists are just the flip side of the creationists.
It's
me instead of them.
It's extremes. When you push things into complete opposing extremes, you tend to. It's like liberal Democrat, right? Liberal conservative, or it's like, where are you? George Bush Republican or Barack Obama Democrat? Well, aren't both sides controlled by Wall Street and London? Yeah. But it's the way the game is manipulated. Because if you think about it, things in physical reality tend to always have extremes. Hot, cold, high, low, wide, thin. Questions like freedom don't tend to. The only extreme is the absence of it. If you think about questions of that sort, the absence of peace, you might find. You could maybe define it that way, but peace itself doesn't have an inherent opposite in the same way that you would think of things that are physical. So materialists, in addressing this question of the human condition and human identity, because if we're dealing with a master-slave culture, what we're specifically dealing with, like we saw with the tyrant, is a desire to shape a certain worldview, a certain self-identity, which is going to be rooted in bestializing that subject or the victim, and reducing their qualities to a state where all that is real is something which you could physically see, taste, touch, or smell. But everything that you can't do that with doesn't really exist. It's like an illusionary epiphenomenon or something, or caused by the material genetic predisposition of you, or something. Science is not apolitical. That's, I think, the key to this whole lesson here, is that when you have a political system which preys upon people's stupidity, keeping them from accessing greater degrees of freedom, you can't just do it. You can't just say, okay, now it's time to burn the Jews. You can't just say something like that, or you can't just say, like, it's time to. In Germany, there's certain people who are less fit to survive. That their cost of overhead of upkeeping these certain people in our society is too much when we want healthy people and we have fixed monetary resources to go into upkeeping our citizens. You can't just say, now we have to thus kill them. Can't kill your grandma. You have to give a reason. And science, the monopoly on who controls the scientific ideas, is going to determine whether a political system which is irrational is justified. And so, one of the things I want to look at, a good example of this, which I'm going to run through very quickly just to drive this point home, and I don't want to drag this class on forever, but I think there's another hour and a half at least in me. The beginning of the century is very important. Offers a very clinical case study of this. Now, every educational institution, from Harvard to Yale to McGill, was generally teaching the science of eugenics. this was not a controversial thing. This was taught. This was, if you wanted to be and have a position in a school, you generally had to take on, at least on the surface, the opinion that this was legitimate. These two propaganda campaigns here you see on the left did not come from Nazi Germany. They were American. Only healthy seeds must be sown. Check the seeds of hereditary disease and unfit by eugenics. That was produced in the United States. Eugenics is the self-direction of human evolution, yada, 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 like a tree, weird metaphor. And then you got Germany, 1936. Now that poster offers something as well, because what flags do we see there that are kind of unexpected?
The United States?
Yeah. You know what, yeah. British, American, got Swiss in there, yeah. Yeah.
Is that Ireland? No, it's not. What country is that next to Great Britain on the side?
I don't know. I think that's India.
India.
I think so. I'm not too sure.
And with the White
No, what is
Cross, is that Switzerland?
White Cross, Switzerland. What is that? This one here?
Besides the bridge back,
Yeah.
I think it really has.
Which one?
No.
Okay. No, it's not. Oh. Doesn't matter. Point being, there's some. What that means, Birgit, you want to translate the title there?
Wir stehen nicht allein. We are not standing alone.
Right. We're standing.
And Gesetz is the law, and then the rest
Doesn't matter. The key thing I wanted you to translate was the title there. We are not alone. Have no fear, German people. All these other nations are with us in eugenics. Right? We're doing it. They're doing it too. It's okay.
What year?
This is 1936. Now,
They were teaching that at schools?
oh yeah, oh for sure, yeah. 1907, Indiana became the first state to legalize involuntary sterilization. 30 states thereby followed, making it a total of 33 actually. 1928 in Canada, the Alberta legislature passed our Sexual Sterilization Act to sterilize deviants, imbeciles, criminals, African Americans. Women got hit pretty hard in this one. 1933, that followed it identically in British Columbia. Now, I don't know why the Canadian flag wasn't yet on this thing here, because German eugenics laws were actually modeled on the British Columbia ones. Yeah. A lot of people think this stuff came from Germany. That's, as you can see, it's not the case.
The Canadian flag didn't exist at this time, the way we know it.
Bah.
That's a really
Ah, new hypothesis.
United Kingdom.
Yeah, but I still think
Oh.
the Canadian
Yeah, that could be.
Canadian one married it.
Yeah, but we might have still been considered under, because that was the empire. The empire still existed, so we weren't really. Yeah, I mean, the flag under that system, we still aren't really a nation as such yet, but we haven't come to that point yet. But, but we weren't given like individual credit, you know?
We didn't get control over our foreign policy. So that was 36, that poster?
Yeah.
We got control over our foreign policy a year later, and that's statute of Westminster.
Yeah, probably when Britain wanted us to bail her out from the Frankenstein monster.
Control over domestic policy.
Okay. Okay. So there you go, right? Now, you had a lot of the political leaders, including most of the Supreme Court, were hardcore eugenicists. I'll point out that a lot of the financing for the schools, the studies, all came from the Rockefellers, the Harriman families, just like today. I mean, you look at the studies being funded for stopping our CT scans because they're too expensive, or they, whatever, or the shit going behind Obama's healthcare reform studies that justify why we need to ration and categorize the population into lives more worthy, less worthy, and even less worthy of scarce medical resources in a time of of an economic crisis. Those institutions did not go away. They were not punished in Nuremberg, and they are funding all of it. So that's to keep in the back of your mind. That can be, we've documented this stuff fully. This is Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes at one of his more gruesome moments. It is better for all of for all of the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime, or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough.
Talk about himself.
Yeah. That's the thing with these eugenicists. They never want to start with themselves. That's
Oliver Wendell Holmes III.
No more bushes.
here. Yep. The studies that were used to justify these things were pretty good
Climate change.
Yeah, exactly. This is probably one of the better refutations I found of the methods of climate change, or of proving that CO2 causes global warming. It's not self-evident yet, but you'll see. Now, the first thing to do, well, all of the black dots are black people, all of the white dots are white people. This is a study put out by Dr. Robert Bennett Bean with money from the Rockefeller Foundation, a Virginia physician, who did one of the biggest, thoroughly extensive studies with the biggest data sets of the skulls of white people and black people. Now, he was trying to make a correlation between the size of the skull. The reason for that was based upon a prior assumption that IQ equals, first of all, intelligence. Intelligence is in the direct ratio of the size of your skull. And with that assumption that you're not allowed to question, it's just true, you have to assume it. With that, he then charted out thousands of African Americans and Caucasians. Now, his results, his completely unbiased results, came out and pretty blatantly here proving that whites are obviously more intelligent. Their cranial sizes are huge. Look at all the white dots. Black people, I mean, they get pretty low. That's pretty. Must be something wrong with the race. And so that was the fuel to push through the 1907 Indiana laws and all of the subsequent ones as well. Now, Dr. Franklin P. Mall, one of his collaborators at, I forget which hospital, found this kind of fishy. And he went back and did the studies, redid the studies, except this time the only difference was he didn't label which skulls belonged to white people and which ones belonged to black people. And actually, a little bit different. Slightly different results.
What about the mulatto?
I don't know.
The blonde blue eyes? The blonde blue eyes?
Blonde blue eyes like Aryans or mulatto?
With African?
Probably be a happy medium somewhere, I don't know. But the point is that it doesn't really matter. It doesn't actually matter. Look at the correlation is that it's complete spread all the way around, right? But the damage was done, and they went forth anyhow with the old tests to pass through a lot of these policies. What's up?
So that was at the same time? He did it like...
He did this a few years later. They had passed Indiana, but the other 30 states still went on with the original studies. The first one was done in 1906, and then the refutation was maybe 1910 or something. I'll get it to you after. It's one of those books.
Sorry, man.
Yeah.
Just on the subject of like IQ testing.
Yeah.
That was notorious for being culturally biased too. They used to use it like to deny immigrants like entry to the country, and they would classify people like as idiot or imbecile or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Based on, because you know, if somebody's coming from Poland or something, you can't speak English. You know.
You can't pass any of our literacy tests. Yeah.
You know, or something like that.
Yeah, it's kind of self-defeating. Yeah. So okay, that's just to set the stage. Now, after World War II, eugenics became a very bad word. A lot of these institutions had to quickly find new terminology, and people like Julian Huxley, who was one of the the big famous oligarch puppets of this century at least, but became head of UNESCO. And went on to write in the UNESCO's founding document in 1946 how, though eugenics is still really important, it's probably the most important thing for us. And you can go and download this thing from the UNESCO website. It's called UNESCO its purpose and philosophy. He wrote that it's still important, but now that Hitler's lost, we can't really use the same words. People are kind of disgusted. But since it's so important, we have to change our terminology and our methods to make what's currently unthinkable again become thinkable. Yeah. He went on to found the, he was one of the co-founders with Prince Philip of the World Wildlife Fund, while he was the head of the Eugenics Society in 1962, and it goes on and on.
What is his name?
Julian Huxley. Sir Julian Huxley. Yeah.
Is that the son of like Aldous?
That's the brother of Aldous, the son of Thomas, who we'll get into. Now, this forces us to take a little look again at these assumptions that people are taking for granted. The reason why it's called the Darwin Malthus Revolution is going to become evident very soon. But before we go into the world and the stage that Darwin had lived and was performing upon, it's good to set set the stage. We'll look at the events, both scientifically and politically, leading up to the mid-18th century, where we're introduced to our friend Darwin. Now, there's two conceptions. Most of the last 2,000 years, humans have been confined generally to the conception of a fixed universe, one that was created under the, 6 days. You had, the creeping things after the heavens, light and darkness. Then 6 days later, there was man. It was good. That's something like 6,000 years ago. That was the creation. Literal interpretation throughout, and there will be an endpoint. So you had a very fixed set limit of space-time that human beings were operating in for much of human history. Until the Renaissance. And at that point, you had this complete explosion of ideas founded from the wave that was set by people like Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa, the founder of the modern nation-state, modern physical science, the people who were his students, like you could say Leonardo da Vinci, who he did a lot, but the discovery or the observation by da Vinci of fossilized seashells on the top of these massive mountains in Italy was that, well, this probably wasn't caused by the flood. Seashells don't float. So for the first time, he really drove forth the point that the Earth is much, 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 much older than the accepted 6,000 years. And that actually, he actually postulated that the tectonic plates were moving. There's some motion of the continents that create the mountains. Because this must have been underwater.
So
Yeah.
If the seashells are on top of a mountain, that means the water level was a lot higher.
Either was a lot higher. Yeah.
Or the mountains were a lot lower.
Right.
Oh, because when mountains crush together, they go up.
Exactly. You had, from him and his collaborators, you had people like Kepler, who we mentioned briefly before, had shot out the idea that there's a fixed circles just floating around, creating the paths of planets in the solar system, but actually that because they're ellipses, and we can go into that, that's a whole other class unto itself, but that it's purely changing. In fact, at every moment along the planet's orbit is a moment of change, governed by a principle, but a principle which is always changing in every infinitesimal moment. So that overshook huge foundations. Later on, you had the advent of Benjamin Franklin and discovering that this crazy, scary stuff coming out of the heavens wasn't just out to burn your house down and start forest fires, but that there was a connection between lightning and electricity. And the discovery of this thing as a principle allowed us to actually begin to, use it. Whereas before, it just kind of made us scared. Lavoisier had discovered that, in fact, no, chemical elements are not all the same now as they were at the beginning of creation, but that there's a point of perpetual transformation where all chemicals and all isotopes, well, he didn't know about isotopes, but all chemicals are changing their mass and becoming other elements, yeah.
Well, not elements.
Well, not elements. Yeah, combinations, like compounds. Yeah. And he was the example for, his discovery was founded upon the principle of weighing first air, which was thought to be sort of a substance fixed unto itself, and mercury after burning it in a vacuum. And by realizing that the mercury was more heavy after a couple of days of doing this, and an iron had, or sort of rust had formed on the iron, he was able to measure the increased density of or heaviness of the mercury, and compared it to the loss of weight of the air, and found that there was a direct ratio where the air had become simply nitrogen, where you could put a little fire in, the fire would go out, so nitrogen doesn't have oxygen. The oxygen, where did that go? What caused the rust? Right? So in fact, it wasn't like there was something new being introduced. There was a transmission of those elements into the mercury. So that has pretty profound implications. Charles Lyell, who actually started off, though he switched later on as one of the collaborators of Darwin, proved Da Vinci's theory that the tectonic plates are indeed shifting, and that the continents were at one point all one. Called it Pangea or something. But that everything is all of the physical, non-living aspects of our Earth are in a slow, gradual, continuous transformation. You can't see it with your eyes, but we can know it. And so this was completely breaking the stranglehold, or the structure of this fixed idea of the universe. Now the question is, if you're thinking about, is the universe changing, or what is the nature of the universe, you tend to have two choices, right? If you're going to go. Your first two, it's either a universe of no change, or it's a universe of change. Right? So, increasingly people, as they started realizing how much things are changing, the question then became, how? In what way is it changing? And do you know what options we have ahead of us if we were going to approach it rational, in a scientific way? What are our options for how things change?
Random.
Random? Okay. So it's just like changing in a random way? Okay. Just changing without care of directions, just up, down, who cares?
Upshift.
Upshift? Okay. Things are getting somehow better of some sort, or things are going up? Right. All right. So there's either a progression or a certain direction towards improvements, either just complete change governed by maybe a point of equilibrium, who knows, or just no point whatsoever, or things are just increasingly getting worse and worse, to the point of maybe some chaotic death of the universe. Now, obviously, these folks were not just, they weren't just, it's interesting to see sometimes, and to think about the fact that these scientists weren't just, they weren't just, they didn't have a niche. They weren't just scientists. I mean, Benjamin Franklin was Benjamin Franklin. He organized Washington, Hamilton, the whole thing, was the revolution. Lavoisier was one of the main collaborators who made that happen, and was organizing to have a constitutional republic in France through the French Revolution, which was undermined by the British. That's a past class you guys can watch online.
Nice plug.
And here, only 2075. No. Who lost his head under the Jacobin mobs. Charles Lyell, good guy. Now, that's the scientific sort of ideas, conceptions that are sort of setting the boundary conditions of the world that Darwin was living in. Politically, yes, we had the American Revolution. Yes, we had these new ideas of national sovereignty in opposition to being milked by a parasitical empire that were taking hold, as other nations also wanted what America was accomplishing, which you saw with Germany, you saw it with Russia, especially these two nations, were going with the most solid American system development projects, national banking, protectionist policies, which created the German Zollverein, which was put forth by the American system economist Frederick List. Russia had similar things under Tsar Alexander, of, again, building up its local infrastructure, its ability to, sustain its own population. And this was a complete existential threat to the empire. There was also infighting within the empire, and that's, I think, a very important one too, because since Henry VIII, the usefulness of a theocracy of London, of Britain, with the Anglican Church, was becoming increasingly useless in trying to maintain a bloodthirsty empire. Now, people generally know the story of Henry VIII and the Anglican Church, right? A certain conception there? No? Okay. All right. So
Got a divorce?
got a divorce. He wanted. Yeah. Right. Exactly.
Got many.
Huh?
Got a few.
Got a few divorces. Yeah. Yeah. His wives were. If you found out that Henry VIII wanted to marry you as a woman, you were probably scared shitless. So not to lose your head over. The church, what made it useful for a long duration was that it allowed for the acceptance of the divine right of kings, of hereditary succession, and that your bloodlines, gave you, a deistic type of privilege which you would not find with commoners. So you can see how that could be useful. That ideology would be useful to empire. But increasingly, you had, interestingly enough, as I was researching this class, most of the opposition to imperial foreign policy, especially in India and Africa, in London, like internal policy, was generally coming from places like the House of Lords, the Church of England, and increasingly the idea that the reality that the British Empire stood for evil is sin became very distasteful for people, even if they had these weird aspects of their religion that accepted, kings being the head of your church. It became the idea that the universe is governed by a deity became a completely unacceptable thing for the oligarchy, because at that point you couldn't control. At that point you couldn't even control your own nation. You have rebellions happening within London. This is where you have people like, especially Thomas Huxley, being introduced. The idea, Thomas Huxley was a completely poor kid who was born to a totally ghetto family. He started his career as a young guy doing surgeries on the indigent of London, people who have the worst diseases. And London had, they treated their people probably worse than any other nation. And so he had it pretty rough. But he was a sharp guy, quick wit, and he must have had some pretty powerful patrons, since he was given immediate positions within the British Royal Society, within teaching positions, all sorts of boards of directors. He was all of a sudden on it, at the age of like 25. Darwin calls Huxley his bulldog. Because the thing about Darwin is that, and I watched a bunch of these Stanford lectures on Darwin's legacy, and the thing that all of these professors are commenting on is how interesting it is that Darwin never really had to fight for any of his ideas. Mostly when you have a new discovery, you have to really, you're up against a lot of opposition. With Darwin, he had all sorts of people doing all of the dirty work fighting for him. And you're thinking, well, who would that be? That's interesting, right? Okay, so Huxley's the main guy in this. And also Hooker, who we'll get into after. You had a certain club, like an inner sanctum of people who just made it their mission to make Darwin the thing, right? Okay. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Right. The interesting thing is that these guys weren't of bloodlines themselves. They weren't of rich, affluent families. These were generally just lapdogs, commoners. And their idea was, like Thomas Huxley, was that no, you're simply being in a really old, affluent family should not give you the authority to lead the empire. It should be a meritocracy. Doesn't matter who you are. If you've got the bloodthirst, if you can if you can show your alpha maleness, you're in. That should give you the right. and he lived it. So this is Darwin's original book in 1859, The Origin of Species by means of natural selection. And I wrote it big here, but just the small little subtitle is "or the preservation of the favored races in the struggle for life." That's the lesser-known subtitle of Darwin's Origin of Species.
Never heard that before.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Now, in wondering where he developed his philosophy, he actually tells you straight up in his autobiography. I snipped a little quote out from it, and I think that'll, introduce something interesting. Who would like to be Darwin for a moment?
Okay.
Oh, you can be again after.
Right. Yeah. I happened to read for amusement Malthus on population, and being well prepared to appreciate the struggle for existence which everywhere goes on from long continued observation of the habits of animals and plants, it at once struck me that under these circumstances favorable variations would tend to be preserved, and unfavorable ones to be destroyed. The result of this would be the formation of new species. Here, then, I had at least got a theory by which to work.
I wonder what that amusing thing that Malthus would have been writing about. I wonder what that was. Let's get to know Malthus. Thomas Malthus, by the way, is a guy that was a British East India Company employee whose ideas had pretty much been totally discredited, and they needed to be rejuvenated again. This is a little segment from his essays on the principle of population. Yeah?
So they were discredited in its own time?
Yeah. Yeah, with the American Revolution, with the development that came after, the credit system. We'll get into that later.
By history.
Yeah, by history, yeah. By all of history.
Sorry, man.
Yeah.
That just reminded me, like a lot of what he's saying about natural selection thing, that was also their ideology for economics too, right? The free market.
Right here. All right, Assad, you could be an evil guy. For once in your life. Louder. Louder. Come to the mic, we'll catch you.
All children were born beyond what would be required to keep up the population to a desired level must necessarily perish, unless room be made for them by the deaths of grown persons. Therefore, we should facilitate, instead of foolishly and vainly endeavoring to impede the operations of nature in producing this mortality. And if we dread the too frequent visitations of the horrid form of famine, we should sedulously encourage the other forms of destruction, which compel nature to use, instead of recommending cleanliness to the poor, we should encourage contrary habits. But above all, we should reprobate specific remedies for ravaging diseases, and restrain those benevolent but much mistaken men who have thought that they are doing a service to mankind by protecting the schemes for the total extirpation of particular diseases. Thomas Malthus, Essay on the Principle of Population, 1791. Oh,
Should have been principle of depopulation.
So if anyone tells you that they're Malthusian, walk away. End the conversation.
Yeah, I met some people who proudly proclaim that, I'm a big fan of Malthus.
Oh yeah.
I believe in that.
Yeah, it's pretty scary when that becomes socially acceptable again. Of course, he doesn't just say this straight up front. You have to read through about 90 pages of his essay before you actually get to, something like that.
You say it's like amusement for them.
Yeah.
They're amusing themselves with this kind of stuff.
Yeah. So that's the thing, right? You've got natural checks and balances on population, The universe is ordered. Humans are, are natural in a certain sense, because every time we get overpopulated, nature's there to bust us down with a disease, uncleanliness. Nature's there to kill us. Just like the animals, if the rabbit population gets too populated, nature's there to make sure that the moms eat the babies and the population re-regulates. So it's cool. Also, the idea that, what is it? But above all, we should reprobate specific remedies for ravaging diseases and restrain those benevolent but much mistaken men who have thought that they are doing a service to mankind by protecting the schemes for the total extirpation of particular diseases. He was a big fan. He didn't like cures for diseases. That was
You didn't like what?
cures for diseases, like vaccines and stuff. Polio was his friend. Yeah, they're not enlightened like he is, trying to do good.
Question.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and ask the unaskable question, which
Yeah.
is, so why is this wrong?
Why is this wrong? Well, if human beings are just like an animal, it's not wrong. It's absolutely correct.
It is suffering
So,
What is
suffering a lot. Make some more room in the cage by letting some die.
yeah, sure. The question becomes then, the fact that we do such things like make discoveries, because we could alleviate our population burdens in one of two ways, right? You could either cull the human herd if you don't want to end your empire, if you want to change your policies, you could just cull the human herd. Or you could recognize the Malthusian paradox, which is that he works for the British Empire and can't see how, because his policies, the policies of empire, rely on the stupidity, keeping people dumbed down, causes them not to really be producing very many discoveries. Because another way you could alleviate a population burden is by introducing literacy, encourage people to use their minds, right? And if you're doing that, then you can imagine people in Africa discovering cures for diseases instead of killing each other with American-made, or at least American and British financed weaponry. See, that's either, but that's the thing. Malthus a priori believes in Adam Smith. He believes that free trade and the policies of empire, Hobbes, foreign policy, each against all, he believes that that's actually the natural state of human affairs. And because of that, what he's a part of, as a spokesman for the British Empire, he can't see that as being unnatural. If anything, it's the natural expression. Empire is the natural expression of the law of the jungle on a global scale, on a political scale. So, because it's natural, it couldn't change. Thus, what people do, in terms of these things like eat and overpopulate, these things, that's what's unnatural.
Well, what is the natural order of human behavior, like humans, I guess, on a global scale? If it's not that.
Well, let's for the time being, that's the subject of this whole class.
Sure.
But for the time being, let's put the hypothesis on the fact that he's probably off somewhere. Let's assume we don't have to kill people yet. Okay. Now, the issue why Darwin is celebrated is because he invented a mechanism. At this point, everyone kind of knew that things were changing, developing, but there was an absence of a mechanism. This was the mechanism. The idea that, generally in a nutshell, you've got, well, here. All right, this is basically, in a nutshell, this is the struggle for existence, right? That's, why does life happen? To exist. It struggles to exist. That's the purpose of life. This is Richard Dawkins' revelation of Darwin's revelation. This is basically it. Why do you live? What's the purpose of life, right? Why are people? The struggle for existence within finite territories, spurned on by random genetic mutations, giving rise to some more fit random mutations which destroy the unlucky less fit, thereby becoming new species over time, which is in all this very gradual, gradiental process, kind of like the shifting of the tectonic plates. shifting of continental drift. Yeah.
Now,
Yes.
is it that this is not a universal principle at all? Or is it that this is a universal principle, however, it's incomplete, it's not the whole picture?
It depends on whether the universe is chaotic or not.
So, okay, let me just give an example.
Yeah.
African people are black. Why?
In Darwin's view? In Darwin?
No,
I'll tell you. Okay, well, you'd assume it has something to do with the environment, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. In Darwin's, if you stick to the line of Darwin, the gene only gives information to the cell. The cell does not have any way, the gene is a closed system otherwise. So the cell and the environment cannot in any way influence what the gene does. Right? Now, there are random genetic mutations that are occurring within the gene, and because of those genetic mutations, different pigmentations had arisen. The Caucasian ones in Africa, albinos died out pretty quickly. Yeah. And the darker pigmentations, those ones edged out and those ones survived. So the environment actually, in Darwin's original epistemology, has nothing to do with the transformation, aside from the fact that the gene is randomly mutating. It's chaos. It's a chaos theory. So things are just randomly happening.
That's his original epistemology?
Yeah.
Because I always thought that you said, oh, it's the environment.
No, the environment. The environment is going to determine which traits are dominant, pass off, and eliminate other species. Which ones are going to give you the edge over other ones?
Also,
Over very long periods of time. We're talking.
So the issue is that
very long.
these genetic mutations occur,
Mhm.
but are they random or are they not random?
Right. That's the thing, and that's the cracks in the structure, which all of Europe, European continental science, American science were on top of this. I mean, people were generally a lot of biologists and scientists were pretty happy about Darwin because for the first time they were finally getting some leeway over the church's crazy structure of just like pure hardcore fundy dogma. So they were happy they were getting a chance to actually breathe a bit, but then they weren't ignorant to the cracks. This is what was immediately jumped on, and there were big cracks. Because the basis is there's no missing links, because you believe that humans are just like continental non-life. You're attributing life to changing as non-life changes in very slow, gradual processes. But yet you look in the records of species, and where are you going to find the slow? You should be finding like infinite varieties of different species as the horse transforms from a little thing to a bigger thing. And there's really only about 7 different subspecies of horse that we know about. So what happened in between? Should have a lot of these fossils. Especially if it takes about 1 million years. The estimate by most Darwinians today is that it's about 1 million years for a species to change its qualities.
Well, because the conditions for fossilization are pretty specific too.
It doesn't change the fact that there's really nothing going on. It doesn't exist. I mean, their argument back then was that our fossil records are too little or too scant. That was the general argument. That hasn't changed at all. It's just we're assuming that. But we've actually got a huge density of fossils from all parts of the world too. I'm just saying. I'm not saying that this is like a smoking gun. Like I'll allow for maybe maybe it's true. Maybe we just don't know. There's a lot we don't know about the world, right? But that's a big one. Transformations occur within species rather than across species, so you don't tend to get too many hybrids of like peacocks and flamingos. Peacocks have their own subspecies within a genus of peacock. You've got horse within horse and such. So there seems to be this the genes are fighting to survive, but within their species and not crossing the species.
Probably peacocks and flamingos came from a common ancestor.
Probably, but the fact that they're split off into specific directions, like that don't thereby do more of this, like cross.
There's no interaction between several different species and it's not affecting each other.
Yeah.
The effect is more or less isolated within the species, within each species.
Yeah, sure.
Flamingo are in competition with each other.
Yeah, there's many different flamingo subspecies and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they can't crossbreed and stuff.
Why would you expect them to cross?
It's a genetic survival of the fittest. It's the gene surviving, fighting with other genes. It's not on the genetic basis. It's not distinguishing your species. It's distinguishing one gene in an environment. Basically, you could explain it away. I mean, you could find explanations to do so, but it doesn't actually get at the issue that in the philosophy of Darwinism it's incompatible.
What is, I don't
The
understand.
idea that the species are differentiated,
Yeah.
it doesn't fully account for that. That's all I'm saying.
His theory.
Yeah, in its account for it doesn't fully account for that.
So the
It's a
fact that
paradox.
you have these different species that seem similar yet they don't interbreed, that's the paradox?
That they don't interbreed, but that yeah.
Yeah, because like if they want to strive for the best combination, like a bird, so birds together,
Mhm.
it should work. Like it's just genes, but it doesn't. Like in reality, it never happens.
Mhm.
That's what you're saying.
Basically, yeah.
I don't
Was
get it.
Darwin
You're
speaking
saying that
in
it's-
genetic terms like this, or are you combining the Dawkins work with Darwin's work?
No, this is Darwin's. Later
Darwin
on,
is speaking
this
of
has been
genetics.
modified. This has been modified increasingly today.
Darwin didn't know anything about genetics.
No, genes themselves weren't known, but on the
That was discovered afterwards.
yeah, that was
Both
discovered
as
afterwards,
mechanism
yeah.
for,
yeah.
But why do they say
But-
that this is really
Well,
why
hold on.
do they say that people spend it in Africa?
I don't. I'm not too sure. Might be true. I'm not sure, but I know that.
But I still don't understand
Well-
your last point though. Like, would it be that the species interbreeding would be a natural advantage and you expect them? Like, it should benefit them to interbreed? I don't understand your point. That you're
Yeah,
making.
it generally. I think the idea so far is that it would benefit them to have that. But it's more. It's even not even that, because what Darwin was thinking about was that on this. It's because of random mutations that it occurs, which aren't affected by. They aren't directly related to the organism as a whole. There's a quality which is created, darker pigmentation or whatever, in the mutation, which, because it's successful, multiplies itself.
Yeah. They're able to have more offspring.
Yeah. This was modified later to allow for like a 50-50, like is it nature or nurture? And so increasingly it's, in modern times, it's become a half-half debate, like behaviorists today are of the opinion that it's 50% each one. So there's modifications that have been made to it. It's not, but at that time, and I wish I could go into it more. I mean, like I'm saying, I'm just pointing out the paradoxes that people, and I'm going to go into some of the other scientists and biologists who did offer valid alternative theories at that time, what they were pointing out as being the unaccountable things that were in Darwin's theory. And this particular one, I'm not well versed enough really to fully like. I wish I was, and I will be after this, but I can't really develop it much more than that. I wish I could though. Yeah, officials.
I was just going to say, how is it that, did he not notice that there's a bit of a paradox? If somebody develops a natural gene that gives them a natural advantage, can this necessarily copulate and procreate with an organism that doesn't have that gene?
If there's a gene that has developed a
Gene that
certain
gives a
advantage.
certain man an advantage, makes him like a super guy or whatever.
Oh, Joe.
If there's a gene that gives a guy a natural advantage, can he
Yeah.
go and have like, can he have offspring with a person who doesn't have that gene?
I don't know. I think so. I'm
Darwin
not too
wasn't
sure.
thinking in terms of genetics as showing.
Yeah, it was just random
Genetics
mutations occurring.
come later, so there wasn't really an understanding of, okay, the species has so many genes
Right.
can't procreate with another.
So there was the understanding that you would pass on your traits to your kids.
Hereditariness
Yes,
was an element
been
of,
known
yeah, it was a
for
very
long
important
time,
element of this,
right?
yeah.
So there was an understanding
pretty
that you
good.
pass on your
Okay.
traits to your kids.
Yeah. I would say one thing that I did note was that Francis Crick did take that thought of the mutations on the small not being able to influence cells when he was looking at DNA. So Francis Crick would say that in his idea of DNA, DNA can only offer commands to the proteins surrounding the DNA, but the DNA can't be changed by the proteins, which again, there's certain problems that you're going to come up with. When he gets a viruses passing on, again, hereditary, like if you're induced to get a virus and you pass it on to your children, it's changed your DNA, but the viruses come from the outside. So Francis Crick was the guy that discovered the helix formation of DNA. Yeah. All right. The other ones, though, I think are more juicy in terms of the order from chaos that we've established already as one of the. Here you have a world of pretty solid, signs of order, but yet you're saying that at the root of it all, it's just random chaos. It's pretty tough to explain away. The other one was how life. You got these discontinuities, right? So how the principle of life could develop from non-life. How conscious life. So things like your cat is different from a plant. So there's a certain consciousness that would develop within life that can't be explained. And then reason, like how would human reason or self-consciousness develop from just simply pure consciousness? So this was actually dragging it down. It was losing a lot of steam because of these discrepancies. And I'd say a lot of the non-Darwinian evolutionary thinkers, specifically the ones that I think were making the biggest waves at that time were people like James Dwight Dana, who in terms of their approaches to a mechanism were drawing a lot of attention. James Dwight Dana, if anyone's heard of the principle of cephalization, what he was looking at when he was trying to figure out, well, what is the thing that distinguishes all life from non-life? What determines the direction of the development of it? He was looking at the role of the central nervous system and how you have, over time, clearly observable, increasingly developed central nervous system that permits the organism to interact with the environment. So you think like you've got seashells, lobsters. Even before that, you've got like jellyfish, which have a very diffused central nervous system, which is sort of And then increasingly, as you get into walking organisms, and increasingly after reptiles, you have mammals, and the density is more consolidated on top of the spine and a brain all around the body. The metabolism increases.
You're like getting bones instead of just being floating.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that was one. There's a certain interface with the natural world that happens through the development of the nervous system. Cuvier, well, actually, Lamarck was a fellow who had some epistemological problems, but his idea was more focused upon the environment and how there's a certain, because of the desire for survival within species, that as the environment changes, and it changes quite often, you get ice ages, you get all sorts of things, there's a certain desire within the animal to not die, to survive. And so as let's say, climate is heating up and trees are getting longer, higher up, the giraffes or what little soon-to-be giraffes want to keep on eating their old fat, the stuff coming off the trees that they always eat from. And there's something which is induced by this desire, passed on through a genetic trait, which accounts for the transformation of the giraffe's neck. Now, of course, this coincided with Georges Cuvier, another French academician, who put forth the theory of the correlation of parts, and that not if the giraffe's neck does get bigger, what'll happen, or the correlation of parts is that if one part of the organism changes, like the heart gets bigger, everything changes in a certain, to accommodate that, because if, let's say, the heart gets bigger, it's going to draw down more of the resources from your other organs, your liver and your stomach and your kidneys. So it'll become sort of a bit of a survival of the fittest thing inside your own body. We're all fighting for the scarce white blood cells.
The heart wins.
And you can see it, right? The problem, if the giraffe's neck is getting bigger and nothing else is changing to accommodate that increasing height of this neck, and the spine is not getting any stronger, the heart's not getting any bigger, that giraffe is going to be dragging its head around.
It's not just one gene randomly changing, the whole body structure changes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that was sort of his. He had his problems too, because he rejected a lot of elements of how species develop. He had a bit of a funny wing to him, but together a lot of people were taking this as a viable alternative as well. Karl Ernst von Baer was a German scientist who put forth the original hypothesis, which today is being explored by Rupert Sheldrake. I mean, there's a variety of biologists and microbiologists today. A lot of them are reductionists, but they're looking at this quality of morphogenetic fields, which is this idea that, well, you can see that things emanate in the universe in sort of fields. So like a candle is emitting a certain amount of light, a certain amount of heat, but at a certain point it has less and less effect to the point that you really can't feel much of anything, or you can't see the light. I guess a better example would be the sun. There's a certain field being generated, an electromagnetic gravitational field emitted by the sun, which has an effect upon the surrounding matter. Right? So you got these planets locked in orbits, and the orbits are their ellipses are being governed by least action pathways, such that if it was anything other than an ellipse, if it was like ovals or something, they would be going through more work to go along their journey than if they were ellipse. Now, Karl Ernst von Baer was saying, well, maybe there's a similar principle in that which organizes life in living things. Because here we are, we partake in non-life, right? If you break us all down to our smallest bits, we're made up of the same elements, molecules that you find in non-living things. So the carbon in my table, somehow, it's there. I got carbon in my body. Somehow there's something different organizing the carbon making up this table than the carbon organized, within my body. Something different happening. So he was thinking, well, there might be a certain type of field creating a certain boundedness, and we know the table has a certain boundedness. Things that manifest in fields have a certain boundedness, where they cease to. Comets at some point will either get locked in as an orbit and become part of this, orbit. Will become an orbit within our or solar system, or if they're too far away and the influence is too little, they'll just be deflected a little bit and they'll go in some other direction to some other galaxy. But with humans, things have a certain physical limitation to them. So he was looking at, okay, well, what is that? How does that work? Of which I've done no work on, so I'm not going to go deeper into it. But the interesting thing also is he was leading the fight to bring back Kepler's harmonies, especially in Germany, which at that point was almost completely suppressed. In fact, Kepler's harmonies here in English, if you couldn't speak Old Latin, you wouldn't have been able to read through how Kepler discovered the harmonies of the worlds until 1970 something? Yeah. That was the first time it was translated for any type of English-speaking audience. But he was bringing that in. And the purpose of this is that you couldn't have had, this is a class unto itself, but you couldn't have had the discovery of universal gravitation, the inverse square law, none of these things could have ever been developed if Kepler had not first asked the question, why are the orbits where they are? Right? Not just how can I describe them as ellipses, but why are they in the positions that they are, not some other positions that I could conceive of which his question was, is the universe constructed in a harmonic way? Is there a relationship between how a string is divided into non-equal segments, but that produce a do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, do scale, to how the planets are organized? Now, I'm not going to give away the answer, but you guys can probably guess it. Karl von Baer put out, I think, a pretty solid attack on the chaos element of things, especially. And I'd like to find somebody who hasn't spoken yet. Okay, Pascal.
What we have discussed here, the reciprocal interconnections of organisms with one another and their relationship to the universal materials that offer them the means for sustaining life, is what has been called the harmony of nature. That is, a relationship of mutual regulation. Just as tones only give rise to a harmony when they are bound together in accordance with certain rules, so can the individual processes in the wholeness of nature only exist and endure if they stand in certain relationships to one another. Chance
is unable to create anything enduring. Rather, it is only capable of destruction.
This idea of proportions,
Mhm.
set ratios of each other.
There's certain ratios. I wouldn't say it's set. Well, the ratio would be set.
Often
Yeah,
changing, varying ratio, but in absolute proportion.
yeah, proportions for sure. Yeah. I don't know how to translate that book.
An der Wiese,
Oh, there you go.
über den Zweck,
Yeah.
above the, what can I say? Zweck. It's a way of means of how nature function, or how is the history of nature.
Okay. All right.
Is
Yeah.
Zweck der chance?
Nein, es ist ein Zweck. There is behind. There is a reason.
Oh.
Yeah, Zweck is
It's like reason?
Like the reason, yeah.
Okay. Reason. I like that.
Reason in the
What's Morgan
engineering?
Vorgängen is like a mechanism
Okay.
in nature.
Okay.
Principle, so that is like a principle.
Yeah, Zweck.
Principle of
Yeah.
rule or law.
Yeah, reason, principle.
Mm.
Yeah.
Okay. So, again, this, in light of a lot of the political developments, really put Darwinism as a whole on the wane. People were not necessarily absorbing it as quickly as T.H. Huxley and his collaborators meant, but at this point you had a huge propaganda campaign centered around what's called the, well, actually it's kind of funny, the X Club.
Original X.
This is a club of about 9 people that had formed around the 1860s, late 1860s, in response to all of the continental and American scientists who were going on the attack against Darwin's interpretation. And they made it their mission to just intimidate with all hell and with a lot of financial means behind them the debate into, again, this very hardcore radical. You're either radical Darwinist hardcore or you're radical Christian Fundy hardcore. You're one or the other. Pick a camp. But if you're not, we're gonna ridicule you and you won't get funding and whatever. So these guys here, just to run through. These are just some of the more prolific ones. Huxley was the co-founder. Joseph Belton Hooker, co-founder. Both of them became heads of the British Academy of Sciences in the 1870s. Occupying I forget which seat Newton occupies, and today Stephen Hawking occupies it.
The chair at Cambridge.
Yeah, forget. Then you got Herbert Spencer. He's the guy that coined the idea of survival of the fittest, as such. Sir Francis Galton, right, founder of eugenics. Matthew Arnold, he's an interesting cat. I got to know a little bit more about him, but it seems like he made his whole career basically leading the fight to deal with the problem of educating the proletariat, where you had a burgeoning middle class, and increasingly the problem of the oligarchy was how do you provide them an acceptable form of education that doesn't give them too many ideas, And so,
doing today again.
yeah, he was like a leading advocate for getting rid of the classics, getting rid of learning Greek, learning Latin, so that people can't study original manuscripts. They have to rely upon somebody's interpretation of them. Like today, try and find a Plato dialogue not written by Benjamin Jowett. I've tried. It's hard. So this, you could say this stuff only really started taking hold popularly in the 1970s, but this guy was like 100 years ahead of his time. There were other characters too, and these guys founded certain things like the Metaphysical Society that had Benjamin Disraeli, a slew of British prime ministers who were part of this thing. And as well, certain publications that you guys might be familiar with today. Most of the people who came through their meetings were the editors of the London Economist, which was founded, by the way, to basically promote the repeal of the poor laws that were advocated by Malthus that Britain put through in the 1840s. where it just decided, okay, well, we have to deal with our overpopulation, so we'll stop feeding and giving money to the poor, and we're going to put them to work. And anyhow, that's another thing. Another one was Nature. Nature magazine was founded in 1869 by the X Club, or by members of the X Club, basically just to completely propagandize Darwin. This is the special on global warming.
Wait, so is the X Club something that, is that like an overt organization, or?
As far as I know, it was generally, yeah, it was like a select club of 9.
Wait, something that you could
I don't know if they
look
refer.
up and read about?
Yeah, I read up on it from an article written by Paul Glumaz. He's a historian. Yeah, I think it's. I don't know how official it was. Whether they just called it this amongst themselves, or if it was actually called, like the X Club. I don't know. It's a good one to look into, though.
Because when you say like they founded Nature, which is like one of the top 2
Peer-reviewed.
peer-reviewed scientific
Yeah.
journals in the world.
Yeah, the peer review is the big problem today. It's only things that fall under certain assumptions are going to be allowed to pass the peer review, and that's what's going to get published. And things that don't, well, sorry.
I'm saying if you look up like the history of Nature magazine, Nature journal, it's like will refer to the X Club as.
I don't know. I doubt it personally. I'll look into that after. Yeah. All right. It's okay. So this is the last portion of the class. Most people will say that what Darwin offered was not a reason for anything, but he didn't give just another theory. He gave a unifying principle of everything, of life, and that's the general sort of description that a Richard Dawkins will make, or what have you. Unifying principle, explain it all. That can be applied to other social realms as well. Okay, well, I think the way to shift gears a little bit now and think about this not just from a biological perspective, because I don't think we should, knowing that we're in a world that doesn't just have living things and it doesn't just have non-living things, but it's got these humans too, and humans organized in societies that have certain different qualities to them that monkey societies don't have, like economies, whereas monkeys have ecologies. Then the first one of the greatest physical economists, an American system economist of the 18th or 19th century was Henry C. Carey, the major economic advisor of Abraham Lincoln. And Carey was the major proponent of the American system protective tariff, the development projects that gave us the transcontinental rail system that allowed for the first time a unified nation as a whole that could travel over inland development, in opposition to the British control of the seaways and all the think about the British. By being a maritime empire, their ability to have a stranglehold as a tiny little island over the entire world where the sun never set was by maintaining the biggest control of sea trade routes. So to the degree that you had maybe 18 different key choke points where all ships had to go through, by controlling simply those, not having to control everybody but those key points, you were able to generally control the global empire. Now, what does an empire whose monopoly depends upon that think about a nation who develops rail across the inland and can now communicate with each other in different parts of the world, different parts of the nation, without having to rely upon sea trades or people who otherwise control all the ships? So, yeah, he's an important fellow, and he's a guy I used specifically because as I was trying to find a theme for this class, I picked up a book we had in our library that I never looked at called The Unity of Law. And it was a book that he had published in 1872. And I opened it up and I found in the first preface an attack on Charles Darwin. Well, specifically he's attacking Malthus, but he's bringing up Darwin. And I thought that was interesting. All right, that's cool. So I read the book. Now, he begins it's called the unity of law because I think it's an interesting way to juxtapose that with Darwin's unity of law. Right? You got both people trying to find a unifying principle, but using two totally separate methods, so it's very clinically interesting. Now, what he does is in the preface, he quotes from Charles Darwin's Descent of Man to draw a point on the same paradox we had seen at the beginning of our class. What makes human beings unnatural? Right. Charles Darwin.
Savages, the weak in body or mind, are soon eliminated, and those that survive commonly exhibit a vigorous state of health. We civilized men, on the other hand, do our utmost to check the process of elimination. We build asylums for the imbecile, the maimed, and the sick. We institute poor laws, and our medical men exert their utmost skill to save the life of everyone to the last moment. There is reason to believe that vaccination has preserved thousands who from a weak constitution would formerly succumb to smallpox. Thus, the weak members of civilized societies propagate their kind. No one who has attended to the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that this must be highly injurious to the race of man. It is surprising how soon a want of care, or care wrongly directed, leads to the degeneration of a domestic race. But, excepting in the case of man himself, hardly anyone is so ignorant as to allow his worst animals to breed.
Must be something wrong with people. Yeah. So a lot of people today they say that Darwin was misinterpreted by the eugenicists, by his cousin and all these guys. No, they took him for his word. And I think I pulled out another quote from the same book just to drive the point. At some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. Charles Darwin. So it's sort of like our destination, right? Eugenics.
The savage races mean
Those who are
the
not...
populations of the colonies?
Yeah, anybody who's not civilized and fit to survive, right? The preservation of the favored races in the struggle for existence. Huh? Yeah.
If you skipped it for yourself,
Yeah, sure. I can give you a copy of this thing if you want it. Okay. Huh?
What do you mean by the savage? The Africans?
I think he would qualify in his mind. Yeah, tribal societies.
Did he give a reason why the civilized societies wouldn't necessarily exterminate the savages?
I think just saw it as natural. I think just thought it was a natural progression. He doesn't.
His book was titled, there was something about the fight among races.
Can I just say something?
Yeah.
Races had to.
Isn't civility having like compassion and mercy and things like that?
No, civilization is empire.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a paradox. They say that does the weak members of civilized societies propagate the kind that weak members should exist in a civilized society, or only a civilized society is able to take care of them?
Yeah.
Haven't you heard
And in the
that?
next passage that you showed is explaining the opposite thing. Like, at some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world.
Yeah.
So it's not very clear about what is a civilized society, what is civilization,
not
who
very
is actually the savage.
No.
it's always us.
That's an understatement. Huh?
It's always us. We're civilized. They're not.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like he's saying, like that would come before the extinction of man. Or no, actually, yeah, that's kind of very contradictory because he's saying that actually the best will destroy itself. It's like in the Republic, when, or like the refutation of Nietzsche, like when in the Republic you have Chrysimachus, which is saying that justice is the power of the stronger, the will of the stronger. And, just like the paradox is, why the weakest actually have more power on the stronger at the end. in the democracy, it's just the will of the society of tyrants will eventually fall anyway.
Oh, they're sort of
They have,
destined
like,
collapse because
changes
they
all the
suppress. Like you're suppressing the masses to such a point that you create like a boiling pot. Yeah, that creates an uprising. Takes care of that. Yeah, then you got Karl Marx's paradox, right? Yeah, perpetual,
Seeing, like,
cyclical.
The strength of the society is how it cares for like its lowest members or those deemed not weak. That's the strength of the society.
That's the strength of the society, right?
How it cares for the weak.
That's what Henry C. Carey's point is, right?
Not to
'Cause-
Darwin.
Not to Darwin, no. But to Henry C. Carey, that's right. To a human being, that's right. To an animal, that's not right. Okay. Yeah, because Carey is getting specifically what he's hitting at, sort of on a multi. He's hitting this at a few angles. Where on the one hand, he is attacking the economic policies of London, the imperial policies, by getting at certain assumptions of Malthus. And the one that he attacks the most is belief in the law of diminishing returns, which is taken from Adam Smith. And this belief has it that in anything you look at, be it a tool, be it a factory, or be it land, you always begin with the most richest state, and the more you use the land or the tool, the more it wears down and the value decreases. Such that if you want to extract continuously a profit from that, not only do you need to introduce more laborers to the land or more people, using the tool, which is becoming increasingly less effective, but you need to, as a landowner or as an entrepreneur, so to speak, you have to keep on paying increasingly diminishing wages to the laborer, right? If you want to keep on maintaining that profit. Right?
There's less and less coming out of it. And at some point you have to go on and look for somewhere else to.
Yeah, then you got to get in a war with somebody else who's. You got to make your land bigger till you get in a war.
I ask you a question.
Yeah.
Like about that, civilized. Okay, put in a sample between Canada.
Yeah.
Quebec and the English part. So who is civilized?
I think until we actually get out of the colonial system of empire, until we get rid of the Queen, we're all in trouble, coast to coast. Yeah.
Not just the Queen, but the Parliament itself.
Oh yeah, the whole system. I mean, until we break.
Parliament is so undemocratic.
Until we stop being a dominion and start being an actual nation, yeah, you're going to get a certain bestialized culture.
Yeah, but I think in order to understand this, I think people should just keep in mind that we're dealing with at a time where it was more than obvious that we had a British Empire controlling the whole world.
That's true.
The relationship of the British is towards their colonies, right? That's when you have civilized and savage makes sense in that type of dynamic. It's the colonizing versus colonized people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That thing you said about Adam Smith, that sounds like a justification for slavery.
It is, and that's Carey's point that he makes in the book, is that the nature of that belief, that unexamined assumption, will continuously lead to absolute slavery. Right? Everyone's getting paid less and less. The land is becoming more and more worthless.
Eventually paid nothing.
Exactly. Yeah. Right.
But I don't exactly see how that happens, because I mean, the way it's applied to contemporary economics is basically just was describing something rather than saying this is like.
Think of the guy in China. Like the guy in China can't afford to live on 20 cents an hour, so we go to the next country that can do it for cheaper, and then the next country that can do it for cheaper.
The race to the bottom.
Yeah, the race to the
Who
bottom.
can we pay less and treat the worst to make the most money?
In theory,
At the same time, it's a justification for progress too. Like you can also your returns will diminish unless you get like cheaper labor, or unless you develop a cheaper way of making it, like leaving your labor the same.
Well, that's what Carey actually in the book, he argues that real progress has to be re-understood. He's attacking monetarism because he's getting at the first point in the human economy that when you're thinking of value, the worst metric to begin with is just money, plain and simple. And he says that what we can know primarily is that we live in a physical world and that things change in one of three ways. We had this discussion at one point. Right? Things are are going to be consumed and produced generally by a process of change in place and change in form. So everything that exists, that goes around in physical reality, is, right, it changes by, you change it from place to place and you change its form. So this was wood at some point, ground up into pulp, produced your table, so you change the form of something. And in regards to the human economy, possession too. So you have change of possession, those three things. And with that as a basis, the point of his unity of law, the thing that he brings together, is this idea of the increased powers of association. He says, first of all, as you don't, as you successfully don't encounter that diminishing return paradox by cultivating the minds of your workforce, what we can observe is that the opposite is the case. That lands don't actually diminish in value as they're used, nor do tools do the same either, like your factories. He says, in observation of the physical reality of the human society's development up until that point, the opposite's been the case. And that the wooden hammer has become a stone hammer, became a copper to an iron hammer, and each time the effectiveness and durability of it increased in value, so it accomplished more work. Same thing for the land. And he pointed out that as you introduce new forms of farming, new discoveries of how to deal with your crops, machinery, you're actually having less people on the land produce more at a greater level of technology and knowledge, such that the quality of life of your population as a whole is increasing. And this, he says, is directly a product of the rate of increase of the powers of association. That's sort of his. For LaRouche, it's LaRouche's gem, I guess you could say. The point of what gives your society economic value is the increase of the productive powers of labor and relative population density. Whereas what Kerry's getting at is essentially the same thing, is that as you're bringing together your consumers and producers, such that you're not just sticking on one thing, like you're not just doing a cash crop the way we do today to places like India, and they just do one thing as a nation.
The cash
that we
crop
say
is
that they're
inherently an imperial.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it says you're not allowed to be sovereign. It says you do this thing well,
Like
so we're going to ship.
In the southern states, they do tobacco. It's exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Identical, yeah. And you see the way we do things today, where products from China that are produced in sweat houses literally travel. I mean, they're made with lumber and raw materials coming from Canada. We ship them all the way halfway across the world, right? Convert them into something to be used by little children sweatshop laborers who don't have a very, very high quality of life and use little technology, and then we ship them all the way back for dollar stores.
So you can buy crappy furniture at IKEA or something?
Yeah. No, that's all Swedish made, actually. I'll stand by IKEA for now. But yeah, it's totally in opposition to the idea of an integrated sovereign economy where your agriculturalists don't just do that, but have access to cities that have industry, and you're increasing the division of labor. So the division of labor is actually increasing as you're giving people, as your society is progressing new technologies, giving people, as you have a machinery that can alleviate the work of slaves. Now you have people who have talents that they can express that they wouldn't have known about if they were just using brute labor force.
Those talents are used for
Can I just say one thing about Kerry versus Adam Smith?
Yeah, sure.
Because I think if you look at the American system, that they did want free trade. Like, for instance, let's say America and Canada had both been sovereign republics back in Abraham Lincoln's time, and both of the goods coming from Canada or the United States were produced by workers and not slaves, and et cetera, et cetera. Both of them had reasonable standards of living, and they were produced fairly. That the United States would not have imposed high tariffs on Canadian goods. That Adam Smith's argument for free trade inherently allowed the British imperial system to continue based on cheap goods made by slaves. And the American system was arguing that that is not a free market, where if you allow the existence of the imperial system that is not a free market at all. And so to counter that, you need to destroy the imperial system because it's not a free market system. And so the way to do that is through high protective tariffs to banish the imperial goods from your market. But if, let's say, you could have an ideal world where everybody's a republic and all the workers are treated fairly, then the tariffs would not be needed.
Yeah, that's why the fact that the different individual states within the colonies had free trade amongst themselves functioned because they had a unified. It worked in that context where they had a unified constitution, which ensured a strong federal government, but certain principles that had to be maintained, like the general welfare. Whereas the fight at that time, before you had the Constitution, was that every state was like an each against all thing. Whereas like Virginia, they wanted just their slaves, they wanted their protective tariffs on certain things, and they had different economic policies, which made a divided house.
I mean, the South.
Which again, that was what Lincoln was up against too, right? That's what Henry Carey was was fighting to maintain. As during the Civil War, you had the British financing and sponsoring the Confederate South it wasn't just to watch some entertainment, it was to dismantle and divide and conquer your arch nemesis, to break it.
The North.
The whole nation. The idea of
a republic.
Yeah.
I remember somebody saying the people who had the free trade systems, if you went to their territories, it was like backwards. They had no railroads, no running water, no electricity.
Yeah.
Right, that's the imperial model. The imperial model doesn't want to develop the territory. Right. Only, give the example of the southern colonies in the States. They would want to develop them, let's say that one was particularly good for growing cotton. They would want to develop them insofar as growing cotton was concerned. So if you need roads to deliver the cotton from the farm to the sea to put on the ships, then they'll build those roads. Right. And if you need some houses to house your slaves, they'll build those houses. But that was it. The only development of the land was for whatever needs you needed to do what you wanted to do on that territory. There was no concept of like a transcontinental railroad to promote the general welfare. That's an inherently Republican ideal versus the imperial model.
But why? Why is it?
Because that's the whole idea of empire, is that you exploit a certain area for its resources and deliver nothing back to the people who live there.
Yeah, the
all
opposition.
of the wealth goes back to the mother, in this case Britain, but before it was Venice, or there was the French Empire too.
Yeah. That's the idea of the difference between exploitation of land and the development of the land. Where today, when you say the words development, the trigger that people have in their mind is imperial exploitation, Like, oh, Africa doesn't need any more development. Haven't we developed Africa enough? Look at them. And that's the general kind of reaction people get, Whereas you look at what happened in the development of North America, of building the transcontinental rail to create new cities around. Like today, if we're going to develop like Pascal was saying, right? If we're going to develop the north of Canada and start utilizing our talent, we've got certain physical talents as a nation, mineral richness that could offer the world huge benefits. But we got to get there. We got no rail up there. We've never done anything. But we don't just want to go there to extract the shit to send it to China's, cheap labor companies to sell it back to us as some finished good. We want to go up there to build cities, figure out what's necessary. It's very not too hospitable, So you got to think through the whole arrangement of your society and composition to develop the land. And that's the Republican imperial sort of, if you want to get the clear sense of the dichotomy.
So what is Republican? Republican what is it?
What we're getting at here, you'll get a sense of it, I guarantee, by the next couple of Henry C. Carey quotes I'm going to go through. You'll get an idea.
That mankind can change the environment for the benefit of the general welfare of all people living there.
Or just
to develop the territory in our own interest for us, instead of for the empire, the development. The state should serve the people. Not the people should serve the state.
But the people also have to, like JFK said, you still have to ask what you can do for your country, not what your country can do for you.
No,
so there's a reciprocal relationship. Right. But this is what's going to be coming through what Henry Carey is actually getting at here. Can I get a reader? Just project it, yeah.
Okay. Here was further proof of the universality of the natural laws, the voice of man in reference to the earth at large, being thus shown to have been the same, that we see it now to be in reference to all the instruments into which he fashions parts of the great machine itself. Always commencing with the forest axes, proceeds onward to those of steel, always commencing with the poorer soils, proceeds onward toward those capable of yielding larger returns to labor, increase of numbers being thus proved to be essential to increase in the supply of food. Here was the unity of law leading to perfect harmony of all real and permanent human interests, and directly opposed to the discords taught by Mr. Malthus. Reflecting upon this, I soon was brought to expression of the belief that closer examination would lead to development of the great fact that there existed but a single system of laws, those instituted for the government of inorganic matter, proving to be the same by which that matter was governed when it took the form of man, or the communities of men.
Right.
Sounds like he's saying that there's a principle guiding evolution in human behavior.
So again, this goes back to what you were asking before about why Malthus was wrong. And had the Malthus clip up before, and you said, why is this wrong? Because history proves that you can take this one piece of land anywhere on Earth, and it will generate enough food, or whatever, to benefit, or to sustain, I should say, a certain number of people. But then through human creativity, we can
thought still unexpressed.
Mm-hmm.
I guess it's not a completed tragedy. I mean, he's still alive. He's still beating his brow. That sort
Right.
of thing.
Yeah.
But for me, it instills this this desire to express something.
Mm-hmm.
This desire to communicate. It sort of speaks to the part of me that hasn't expressed some of the more profound thoughts that I've had.
Yeah. If anything, he compels you. He's compelling your mind to want to make a hypothesis,
Yeah.
which is sort of an act, but that's not a material act. Really.
Seems to be quite a passion.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to read it one more time, maybe before, or do you guys want to try it one more time?
What did you mean by hypothesis? So he's trying to
Oh,
imply
there's an ambiguity in there, right? Like, what is it exactly that the subject is that's unexpressed? Right?
Hypothesis about the subject.
About the subject, and also, what is it in the mind of the author? What is it in his intention that he's trying to convey? You know?
Well, it's not necessarily unique to a poem like this, right? You'd say literature in general. Or
Sure.
in general.
Yeah, you'd always look. Yeah, that's a question you could always ask. You know, it didn't come out of the blue. It was written by a human being.
All right, of course.
Anyway, the question is now, what was the nature of the human being's essence? Well, you know, what was something about their personality that comes through, or that's expressed in their creation? Because ants don't make art in order to communicate anything, really. They do what they do. They're ants. You know, they do it well, but they don't try and inspire each other to do it better necessarily. Yeah.
I like what he says, like the right of thought's expression is divine. So it's like God-given that you're able to express yourself or come up with ideas. It's like a God-given ability.
Yeah.
You also have the freedom to express those thoughts. If you have it, we live in a culture which is we're corrupting ourselves into not expressing our good.
Right.
So that's when you understand that the real evil is believing ghosts, believing that ghosts exist, and that there's certain things you're not allowed to do when you're divinely inspired.
Like self-censorship, just people tend to police their own minds in a certain sense. Yeah, that brings up another question: is like, really, could somebody with a slave identity have written something like that? Could somebody, you know, who sees himself in that way? So this idea of freedom is another one of these things. You know, we've got this. If you were a pure materialist thinker and you were so fixated with trying to define things in their mechanical characteristics, in their material characteristics, looking at human beings right on the physical level, on the one hand, seems kind of unnatural that we exist. Seeing that, again, you think about this quality of freedom, this idea of freedom, tends to have historically been responsible and the instigator for the greatest revolutions in culture, in politics, in philosophy, in science. And so it seems to be there seems to be something about it that gives man an impetus to act in a way that doesn't necessarily ensure his individual security. Right? Because generally speaking, whenever these big changes in society happen, it's at the expense of a certain fixed structure. You know, you've got a revolution of a new idea that's introduced, something, a new conception. So it seems like it's not just any old thought, but there's a certain type of thought. Yeah?
Oh, well, I don't know if this is an answer to your question, but it sounds like there's some sort of censorship involved here. He has thoughts that he wants to express, and there's something preventing him from doing it.
There is something. There's something about a repression, right? You got the word repression in there.
Yeah.
But it might not be such a physical repression either, maybe, in terms of, I don't think there's a tyrannical censorship that's happening necessarily. But you're right. There's some sort of an obstacle to its expression that's happening. Yeah.
It seems to me to be an expression of a tragedy, a tragic expression to it.
Mm-hmm.
There's a certain tension of his not being able to express this that makes the issue of it.
Yeah, you want to be able to express this thing. And the idea that a thought again, it's there's a price of pain that entitles him to it. He's claimed it, this thought, it's already his. But yet, he hasn't quite seen it. Now, do you know who Paul Laurence Dunbar is? Oh, yeah, you got an idea?
I was just going to say that it seems to me the idea that you can know something in your mind without being able to put it into words, and that's the power of your mind, and that it's an idea that your mind internally is able to figure out, absent of your five senses, which is the whole idea of Platonism versus Aristotelianism, and that the mind is able to conceive of higher creative processes and hypothesize, and that sometimes our mind is so powerful that we know something, but yet our language is insufficient enough for us to find a way to express it, and that's the difference between humans and all other animals on Earth.
Oh, and that's the secret of the universe. No, yeah, there's something there, right? That the idea, you could try to, if you have an idea that's not literal, that's not like this table, you can't express it in some, like if he was just thinking about, oh, I wish this cake was made, he could describe the cake, or, that it could be expressed in a very literal way that everyone could understand, because a cake has a certain, you can get a definition that everyone can agree upon. It's a physical thing. Whereas an idea is not something you can sort of lock down in a way that everyone will necessarily agree on the definition.
Yeah.
I was going to
it'll
say,
lose something in translation. Like,
You might.
how is that?
Yeah.
Just think about the concept of that. To lose something in translation means that the idea itself is different from the words used to express that idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It touches on this idea of metaphor too. But you were going to say something?
no, sorry. No.
Okay. Because the question I was going to ask, the next one obviously was the author. Does anybody know who Paul Laurence Dunbar was? No? I wish I had a picture. He was the first generation of newly freed slaves after Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, who understood, because a very interesting problem often comes across the organizer when you're on the street, or whether you're organizing political officials or anyone, is that when you're going through some of these exciting policies for the development of the Canadian North, the development of Africa, or a 50, 60, three-generational outlook for society as a response to the impending global economic meltdown, which generally, most people know in some confused way is looming on the horizon. They just don't really fully know how to think about it because there's so much other bullshit being fed to them in the media. But when you're organizing people, like this just happened to me the other day, where this student, he was a political science student, was completely on the ball with what's going down, and as soon as I introduced questions like the development of nuclear energy, the necessity to increase our access to energy, to development projects, like we used to do in the 1950s and 60s and 70s as a very normal thing. As soon as I started describing these things to end poverty and hunger, and I realized that I'd lost him. And his response back to me was, well, don't you think we've done enough to the planet? Shouldn't we be undoing some of these development projects that we did over the years? Like, hadn't we scarred Mother Nature enough? And it didn't surprise me, because this is something you come across from time to time, more, increasingly in recent years. And I think it gets at an interesting paradox, because here we don't want corruption. People would rather, if you asked them if they would rather give up their sovereignty to an international body of unelected officials to police the world, their general answer would be, hell no. It's not something you run towards. Or your ability to produce food. Would we want to reduce our freedom to produce food and in fact reduce our sphere of activity on the world to do these things? And again, your answer is generally, you'd rather not have a genocide in the world. You'd rather people not starve. But then there's a certain conception which these types of responses, that here we are, there's a certain pristine perfect nature untouched by humans, and then there's humans, which are somehow something outside of nature. You know, the whole progress of the development of the universe was one thing, and then there's us, and we go against that thing. And this idea that we're a foreign species, sort of like a virus infecting a body, a host body, Mother Gaia, who is slowly choking by our simple existence. And so we have to come head on and deal with this, because if you think on the surface, there are certain reasons, if you're thinking very superficially about what it means to be a human being, to believe that. You know, here we are over the course of the entire development of the human species up until now, or of the human species, of life in general, and we seem to be the least fit to survive. You know, there's the fact that we're very hairless, we don't have big claws, you know, we're little fangs, not very useful if you're up against a pack of hyenas, or even like your average big gorilla would tear any of us to shreds. So you think, like, here we are, supposedly one of the newest, members of living species into this planet, and for some reason we physically seem like we're the least fit to our environment, the least fit to be able to survive in the diverse climates. So that's one thing that seems very unnatural. Every other species, you can literally look at any map and you'll find that they're not all over the planet. There's generally going to be, what's going to bind them will be a genetic or an environmental factor, which will be reduced to climate. You know, so you'll have polar bears in the north. You're not going to find them in South America. You've got flamingos in their climate. And all species tend to be isolated. Whereas the boundary conditions for the human species don't really seem to be so fixed. Right? Here we are, every possible habitable, and even you'd consider uninhabitable portion of the world, if you've ever seen pictures of the northern tundra, seem to have human species who have figured out ways to survive across this earth. And it's long been regarded by great thinkers throughout history that this is the case, that there's something very special and unique about us. And I'd say one of those things that's been captured from Egypt to the Greeks onward is the fact that we produce things like poetry. You know? Great art is something which uniquely comes out of the human species. There's something about that. And I think no good class on Darwin should ever begin without beginning with a really good poem. And keep that in mind, if any of you ever find yourselves giving a class on the fraud of Darwin, remember that. Start with a great poem. Okay, mental note. So let's, oh, by the way, the title for the class is right there. I'm very proud of that title. All right. This is a poem written in the late 1800s. Without going into details of who wrote this or in the context politically of when it was written, but I thought JP, who was kind enough to read this thing a few times through to prepare himself, will read this aloud and we can discuss it. Same thing.
Unexpressed. Deep in my heart that aches with the repression and strives with the plenitude of bitter pain, there lives a thought that clamors for expression and spends its undelivered force in vain. What boots it that some other may have thought it? The right of thought's expression is divine. The price of pain I pay for it has bought it. I care not who lays claim to it, 'tis mine. And yet, not mine until it be delivered. The manner of its birth shall prove the test. Alas, alas, my rock of pride is shivered. I beat my brow, the thought still unexpressed.
We could read that again after, but does anybody have a hypothesis of what the subject of this poem is? Yeah.
Is he saying like a thought that never develops, like kind of like a thought that occurred to him, but he couldn't get it out?
Well, there seems to be there's something divine. The right of thought's expression is divine. It seems to be a very specific thought that he's having, but it hasn't quite manifest. He says here at the beginning, at the end, the thought is still unexpressed. He found his inspiration in Frederick Douglass, one of Lincoln's major collaborators, who made it his life's mission. He was a freed slave, or he is a escaped slave, who taught himself science, literature, and realized he made it his life's mission to free the shackles, the mental shackles, the cultural shackles of slavery. And that's what he owes. Frederick Douglass understood that as being the real enemy of mankind is not the physical shackles, because when you free the slave, there's still a slave culture that they've come out of, with slave definitions of ideas.
You're speaking of Douglass now? Or?
Douglass, who is the mentor of Paul Laurence Dunbar, and the inspiration. And Dunbar as well made that his mission as well, and produced one of the most fruitful expressions of the first African-American poetry in this century. I'd say even in history. And he understood as well that even though the slaves had recently been freed, just a couple of years before his birth, that racism, the ideas of the inferiority of species, was still very present and becoming more present in his lifetime. And made it his point to free people by expressing their creativity and encourage the development of the arts. He was best friends with the Wright brothers and other things. I think he's getting at freedom. That's my hypothesis right now. I can't say it's necessarily right.
It's a universal idea.
Yeah.
Well, one thing which I thought was interesting about the nature of ideas, they're the kind of thing that you can own wholly, and yet other people can lay claim to them too.
You mean like they can plagiarize them, or they could?
They can have it as wholly as you have it in your mind.
Yeah, right.
When he says to his mind,
yeah,
he knows that it belongs to him.
Even though others, what boots it? I guess boots is who cares that others have had it, or may have thought it. Yeah. Right. That's good. That's a good observation. Yeah. And so, could we sense something of the author's essence expressed in his creation as well? Can we get a certain idea, do we think, in our minds of the character of the man who would have written something of that sort, even if we didn't necessarily know his history? Yeah?
I don't think he would have liked Sartre.
Probably. Yeah, you could actually probably say that. Yeah. If anybody. Yeah, he probably would have not liked the existentialists that much. He wouldn't have been drawn or gravitated towards existentialist writings. That's probably true. Yeah.
Well, it doesn't sound like what you were saying about before with cultural pessimism. It doesn't look like much of a pessimist. It looks more altruistic.
Very optimistic.
Strange, because that's the opposite. Well, it's not the opposite, but it's an interesting counterpoint to Meredith's observation of there's something tragic about it, but yet optimistic. It's kind of paradoxical.
To me, I always think of this idea of tragedy, of trying to shock the audience into a realization that allows them to evade the tragedy in actual life. And to me, the expression of this fight, this struggle that he's having, trying to squeeze this thought out in some sort of expressible form, and failing. At the end of the poem, I beat my brow.